I'm Doug Fern, and this is my take on music recording. I have always been fascinated by the psychology of recording sessions. Recently, a listener suggested that I interview Terri Bright, who is a singer-songwriter as well as an expert on behavior. In this episode, Terri talks about her dual careers and where they intersect. Terri, to get us started, tell me a little bit about your musical background and what you've done in music in your life.
Sure. So I started out, like many children, taking piano lessons. And then because I played the piano and I wanted to play music in junior high, they said I could audition for the band, and my orthodontist wouldn't let me play clarinet because I had an overbite. So my piano teacher suggested oboe. So I started playing oboe in junior high and played oboe throughout junior high and high school. And in high school in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, we had a really good award-winning concert band. So I learned a lot, got to play a lot of great orchestral type music. And then, like every girl in the 60s, every teenage girl got a guitar and started playing folk songs. And when I did that, I started writing my own songs. And I loved it. So I was 15 then, and I've been writing songs basically ever since. I always wanted to be in a band in the 60s and 70s. Could never find someone who would kind of let me do that until the 80s, when with some other folks we started a band called The Motives, and we played all over New England, original songs and covers, and did some recording. Was a great experience, a lot of fun, learned a lot about arranging and playing, and it was just great. I moved to Boston in 1985 with my now husband, and he and I started a band just based on the songs I was writing. I was playing a Telecaster mostly by now, and started playing around Boston and wherever, and made some great CD recordings in the 90s, and kept writing, and always had a day job, but music was always my passion. In 2000, I got a bull terrier puppy and got really interested in dog training, more so than musicians, and started a career and graduate school, and then got a doctorate in behavior analysis, and have been doing that for 20 years. And then in the pandemic, I started writing again. I was alone with the piano, and I've been writing ever since, and it's been absolutely wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
So your professional training, I suspect, proved to be valuable in your music career as well. Would you say that's true?
It always has been, because for one thing, you get good breathing chops when you play an oboe, and learning about the way songs are arranged, listening to others, key signatures, things like that. It's been wonderful for me, and I depend on it even now, of course.
Explain a little bit about what behavioral analysis really is. I mean, I think a lot of people, they don't have a good sense of what that is.
And I didn't either when I started graduate school, but it has become a passionate study. It's basically the scientific study of behavior. It's a term that was coined by B.F. Skinner, and it's in the School of Psychology, but it's the portion of psychology that is a measurable, provable science. And so when we talk about behavior analysis, we're talking about behavior and learning. So what makes behaviors increase? What makes behaviors decrease? What behaviors can you see? What behaviors can you not see? And what in the environment changes behavior to make it increase and decrease?
And how was that knowledge useful to you in music? And in particular, I'm thinking about in recording in the studio.
I had already done all my recording before I started studying behavior analysis. So it's been retrospective thinking about it. Back in the day, so many times in the studio, it was always men telling me what to do, even playing in the band, telling me what to wear. So there was a real patriarchal type of thing that I was up against. Sometimes it was hard to get my viewpoints in there. When you first start out in a recording studio, you don't know where to stand, what to do. You don't like the way you sound. I mean, my very first recording was somebody at an open mic night taped me on a cassette and gave me the cassette, and I was horrified. I hated the way I sound. I wasn't used to it. But you learn over time what you sound like, and then you have to sometimes convince engineers, producers, this is not what this should sound like, and let's try something else. What is the language you can use to say, let's try this. Do you have a different microphone? Can you turn it up? Can you turn it down? Just keep asking questions until you get people to do what it is that you want, or just to give you the information that you need to get a good take or get your song on tape. So most of my behavioral thoughts about this have been retrospective, trying to shape how I could have shaped the behavior of others. Maybe had I known more, I don't know if it would have helped then or not.
Well, I suspect that your interest in that professional career didn't just come out of nowhere. I mean, you must have been a pretty intuitive person when it came to dealing with human beings to begin with.
Well, that's an interesting point, because maybe when you're a writer and creating song pictures, you're watching what people are doing all the time. You're looking at the behavior of others because you're going to write about it. Sometimes your friends don't like that. Like, oh no, is that me in that song? But you make a good point that could be that I was always watching the people around me. Plus, let's face it, a lot of artists and entertainers, they like attention themselves. So they learn how to behave in order to get attention, so they can play music in front of people.
I thought it was really interesting, your comment about the men that you played with and how they sort of felt that they should take charge and you should just do what they told you to do. And, I hear this a lot, and I hear from a lot of women artists that pretty much gave up on their musical career. I mean, they're still musicians and they still enjoy doing it, but it was so wearing on them, that attitude, that they gave up. And, I don't think that's a blanket statement we can say about everybody out there, that men are universally in that position where they think they need to tell women what to do. Could you elaborate on that a little more? I'm curious about that.
Well, if you think about it, it wasn't that long ago where, and maybe it's still this way, you're still expected to look a certain way, wear certain clothes, sound a certain way. And it was way more so than in the 70s and 80s. And so if you were a woman, you had to be more of yourself and tall and shapely. And if you weren't, you always kind of felt less, which is too bad. And I hope that young women don't feel that way anymore. I think a lot of women did give up. And I don't necessarily think that the men around me were like patting me on the head. Oh, good job, Terri. Let's try it again. It was more that they were all men. All of them were men. I only had one female engineer, and she became a great friend. But that's what the setup was. And sometimes there'd be 3 or 4 of them, and they're all telling you to do something that doesn't feel right to you, like that doesn't sound like what I would sound like, or don't sing it that way, sing it a little softer, a little sweeter, and I'm trying to make a strong point with my voice or with the song. So I don't want to throw the men under the bus that I worked with through the years, because they taught me a lot. They absolutely did. But the process of being a woman and a young woman and having to learn in that atmosphere, it was hard. It was hard. And there's always times that women recognize, oh, this is happening because I'm a woman. And hopefully there's less of that. But there are times that you kind of feel it and you're like, whoop, there it is.
Yeah. Well, I think that in general is probably better now than it was in the past, but I still see it today. And
absolutely.
It bothers me. But let me ask you, when you were in these early recording experiences, was there somebody that was a producer? I mean, somebody who was guiding the whole production towards a goal that you had, everybody had mutually agreed upon was where they wanted to go? Or was it sort of a ad hoc decisions made on the spot about do this, don't do that?
Well, early on, the decisions in the studio were band decisions. Like the first band I was in, those were band decisions. And so that's a whole different thing. I can say that after I met Richard, we did some recording with Jeff Patterson at White Dog Studio in Newton. And Jeff really taught me some things that I hadn't thought of before. Like, are you listening at the way that one note clashes with the melody? Can you change that? And simple things like that nobody ever had taken the time to show me. And that was a great thing to learn. I learned a lot from Jeff. And then at other places I recorded, I learned to judge my own sound with different microphones, for example, which mics would sound best, where to put them. One thing that I think you'd be interested in hearing about in terms of behavior is what Skinner would call verbal behavior. Now, verbal behavior is communicating between a speaker and a listener. And singing is a form of verbal behavior for sure. And behavior can be reinforced from outside of you, but it also can be reinforced inside of you. So if something feels good, you're likely to do it more. And David Palmer, who was one of my professors at Simmons, would talk about verbal behavior and parity. Parity meaning two things that match up. And so as an artist and as a singer, one thing in the studio that you really have to learn to do is find the sound that matches up with what sounds right inside you, right? And so it might be a microphone, a type of recording, placement of a mic. That is a tough skill to learn, but it is really, really important for the artist and the singer to have that opportunity.
Probably when you started out, you didn't have the vocabulary to explain what was bothering you or what you wanted. But as you gained experience, were you able to communicate that to the engineers and other people involved in a way that they could understand what you were going for?
Sometimes it was a very simple communication, like, what other microphones do you have? Because I don't like this one.
Yeah. If somebody said that to me, my reaction would be, what's the problem you're trying to solve?
Sure.
Because I want to know what is it that they don't like about what they're hearing. And, that would guide me to the next step. But when I'm producing someone, I start out with what, I've heard them before. They just didn't come in the door and I just met them that minute. They've sent me multiple demos of songs that they've done in various situations. And so I have a pretty good sense of who they are, what they sound like, and an idea in my head about what I think would be the best way to, capture that. And I don't want to say enhance that, but just make sure that we get the essence of the qualities that I think are really important to make that particular performer unique. So I would have a pretty good idea before I started about what microphone I would want to use or what processing I might use on them while they're singing. But, I'm never convinced that I have it right off the bat. Usually I do, but not always. And sometimes I say, I'll tell you what, let's just give me a couple minutes. I'm going to set up a couple other microphones and let's just hear that. And that does several things. One, it convinces me that my decision was right or that it was wrong and I should consider something else. But it also gives the artist an opportunity to learn how this microphone sounds different from that one. For me, it's pretty obvious standing there in a control room listening with the artist. I can feel when they're happy about the way it sounds and when they're not. Sometimes due to their inexperience, I have to convince them that even though you're not totally comfortable with this is probably what's going to work best for you. But often it's pretty quickly a mutual decision and we just zero in on something right away.
I mean, that sounds like a wonderful collaborative process. It really does. And truly that's likely what winds up happening, but there have just been so many times when I did not have the language, you don't know. And to this day, I mean, now I do. I'm like, too much compression or whatever, but this needs to be higher or this needs to be lower or it's too loud or it's too soft or it's hard. If you don't have the language, then it's hard to communicate. And so your job is as you say, to teach someone. And once you've run into a few people who will teach you that, it all gets so much easier, or someone with whom you have that collaborative type of experience. It's just terrific, and great things can come of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, in my educational efforts on this podcast and other things that I do, I always try to emphasize that building that rapport with the people you're working with and understanding them. But that's not always possible because if you go into a studio time costs money, and the more time you spend experimenting is less time you have to produce your product. And although that's probably money well spent, everybody feels that pressure. I'm fortunate that I don't have a commercial studio anymore. I just work with the people I want to work with. And so for us, time is more of the pressure than money. Right. Because everybody's busy, and I get in people to play on these projects that are superb studio musicians, and their time is valuable. They can't spend all day. They need to nail something down pretty quickly and get out the door. I have the luxury often of doing that, but most people don't, especially when they start out. They don't know what they want precisely. I mean, they may have a sense of it, but they don't know necessarily how to achieve it. Did you feel that pressure of everybody standing around while you're trying to get a sound and, the clock's ticking and the money's going up? I mean, how did that enter into it?
Well, especially because before we built our own studio at home and we were paying for recording, I'll never forget, we hired people, and here's tapes of the songs. And then this player came in and he said, I just need 10 minutes. And he sits down and he pulls out the recording and is making notes like in front of me on the clock at the studio. And I was just horrified, And so the professionalism is so important. The you're right. Time is as valuable as money now, almost. But like you say, to establish that trust is so important, to know that the producer or the engineer are going to listen to you to the point where your opinion is heard, but their professional opinion is going to enhance what you say. You don't go, someone like you doesn't go into the session and say, all right, 20 minutes to establish rapport, and then we're rolling. It just doesn't work like that. It takes as long as it's like, how long does it take to catch a fish? It takes as long as it takes.
Right.
And very, very challenging, because feelings run high. People are very sensitive. In order to get a good take, you have to really breathe a lot, which makes you vulnerable. And it's a process. It's quite a process, and one that I think you're right, that people may drop out of after a while. But at some point, you come to love it. You get used to what your own sound is like and love hearing it. And when you don't hear it, you're like, this isn't it. It should sound more like this or that. It's a process, a fun one. Sometimes not so fun, but when the outcome is great, it's just life-changing.
Well, if I were producing a session and somebody came in either as part of a band or somebody that was hired to play on the session, if they hadn't done their homework and been ready to play, I'd never use them again.
Oh, of course not. Yeah. It was shocking. Yeah.
Yeah, that's just unprofessional. Are you in the music business or not?
Yeah, I know. I know.
And there's great musicians out there that can wing it like that and give you a great product. But it's always better if they come prepared. It's one thing when you're hiring somebody, because you're not necessarily paying for their time at home listening to what you're going to be recording and coming up with ideas. But the good people will do that. They'll come in, with at least something sketched out. All over the studio here, there's pieces of just blank ledger paper with just scribbled notes on it that they came in with because they came up with a part that they thought would be useful, and they were ready to play it, but they were also ready to have it rejected because in that situation, it's like maybe they understand the song and maybe they don't. I think that's a major problem for a lot of people playing the songs, even the people you play with regularly. I find half the time they don't even know what the song's about.
I know. They know their part. When we were recording at our home, we put out 2 CDs and they did great. And so the guitar player would play an overdub and they'd say, oh, how was that? And I would be so sensitive. I said, gosh, that was great. I think we can use that in this other song. And we know each other so well by then. They'd look at me and they say, you hate it. And I'm like, I really hate it. Don't ever play that again.
Yeah. No, I've been through that too, where we'll be, running down a song because oftentimes that's the first time everybody's been in the room together, because we don't have the luxury of rehearsing ahead of time, because they have to travel. Most of these people are not local. So they come in the room, they're prepared as they can be, but there's still going to be a period of exploration. For me, it's always listening, standing there in the studio with them. I'm not in the control room. I'm out in the studio listening to what they're doing. Mm-hmm. And when I hear something that I think is right on target, I'll stop everybody and I'll say, don't forget that is just what I'm looking for.
That's great.
Or the artist will say that.
Yes.
Because that's ephemeral. You could lose that instantly just because it was just something that came out of their fingers and may never occur again if you don't get them to understand that that's what we're looking for.
Yep.
So to me, that's probably one of the most exciting parts of recording to me, is just getting that synergy of all these talents in the room and getting them all on the same page and figuring out what works and what doesn't work. And the people I use are fine with me saying that doesn't work, or say, no, don't do that. That's not, like you said. That's a great part for a different song.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people don't achieve the potential of that session just because they're maybe intimidated or maybe feel other pressures that they can't spend the time to get it right.
It's true. You have to know a lot of parts in order to pull out the one that's going to suit any song that someone brings into you. It's like, what's your palette? The same as if you use oils or watercolors. How many crayons do you have if you want to bring it down to that level? And the more, if you have the big box, if you've got the big 64, you're going to have a lot more to bring to the session than you do if you're like, these are the 10 parts I know really well, and so I want to fit them into your song. That's a nightmare for the writer and the artist.
Well, yeah, and the people that you've brought in, the producers brought in to do this, should be chosen based on the fact that they're going to do what the artist needs. There's some great studio musicians out there that you hire that are just absolutely superb, but they'll give you what they do, and that's why you hired them.
Yes.
And then there's other people out there that could play anything, and it just depends on what's needed at that moment, and they've got the insight and the experience and the ability to just zero in on what it is, the essence of this song and how their part fits into it. That's a talent that I don't think people really appreciate, because most people never have that experience. They don't have that experience of having great people backing them up and just seeing into their songs.
I have played with some great players, honestly, and so that becomes the benchmark. The guitar player that I played with in the Motives was a great arranger, a great player. We played with a lot of great players from Boston, and once they set the bar, there's no going back. You're not going to go back to somebody who doesn't have some good chops, who can't improvise, who can't listen to the tone and the spirit, the mood of what you're playing and match it in somehow,
Yeah, one thing that I find that I think is a shortcoming for a lot of players on a session, whether they're part of the band or somebody hired, is that they never really listen to the words. So they don't have a good sense of what the song's about. They sort of pick up on a mood from what you're doing and what you're singing. They haven't really understood the song. And there's been times in a session when I've just stopped everything right, after 10 or 15 minutes and just spent another 5 minutes explaining the song to them.
That's really interesting that you should say that, because sometimes it's really fun to write a sad song with happy lyrics or vice versa, and so to bring that complexity to a song should be a great gift to an accompanist. And if they didn't pay attention, they're going to miss the chance for the gift.
Yeah, very true. Well, we talked a little bit earlier about the science of behavior and how it applies in the studio. And I think this is really interesting because I've done a couple of podcasts that sort of touched on that, but I have the practical experience, but not the expertise to express it as well as you probably can. Give me some examples of how you would deal with somebody that was either as the artist or as a backup player or part of a band that, they were struggling to produce what was necessary for the song. And, what is it that you might be able to do to help them?
I think that if people understand psychological conditioning. And I'm going to explain briefly two types. So there's classical conditioning, and that's Pavlov, and these are the things that are your behaviors when you're born. These are things that are biologically necessary for you from the time you're born. So if you go into the studio and you plug your guitar in, go to check your mic, and you get shocked in the lip, that's conditioning, because you've just been scared, injured, and that potentially could affect your future behavior. In the same way, if you go in and it's frightening in other ways, somebody yells at you or something, then that causes your heart rate to increase, your respiration rate to increase. You're kind of having literally a fight or flight response. And that kind of classical conditioning is going to affect you when you go into that environment. So the next time you go into that studio, you're going to potentially have that same kind of fear response. Versus if you go in, someone gives you a cup of tea, tells you how great you are, they love your music, are you comfortable? It's still classically conditioned, but in a good way, in a pleasurable way. So that's an important kind of conditioning. There's also operant conditioning, which is when the consequences of your behavior cause that behavior to increase or decrease in the future. So if someone convinces you to use a particular mic and you have the best vocal take you've ever had, the likelihood that you're going to use that microphone in the future and work in that locale with that producer in the future is going to increase because of positive reinforcement. Versus if the producer comes in, well, that was the worst take ever, you can do better, I thought that was awful, that's a punishment procedure, and that behavior is going to decrease in the future. So simple psychology that people like you may be using without even realizing it can get you a much better performance from the people in the studio.
That is absolutely true. And it's interesting to hear you put that into, an academic explanation, because it's something that I've observed for a long time. Mm-hmm. Even when somebody in the studio does something that is maybe not as good as it could be, mm-hmm. I don't think it does any good to point that out. For me, what I always do is just say, that was really good. That's really trending in the right direction. You want to try another one.
Yep. And that's called shaping behavior, using baby steps. If you've seen What About Bob, it's like baby steps to the best solo. That's great. Let's do it like that and add this. You're giving confidence, you're building a new behavior. And people like you, the people in your studio really depend on it, and that's why they drive a long way to be there and work with you.
Well, I hope I've learned something after all these years of dealing with people, but I think I sort of had that intuitive insight from the beginning. If anything, I guess I've gotten better at it, but it's valuable. It's the way to get what you want out of people.
Yeah, it is.
And I have another rule too, which you can probably comment on, is if I go to see somebody that I'm working with performing live, at the end of the concert, I never say a single negative thing about the performance. I wait days, maybe a week, maybe longer, to have like a debrief of things that could have been done better. Mm-hmm. But I never do it at the event or even shortly thereafter. I let some time elapse.
Yeah, those are really tender emotional times. The same is true for me. For example, if I'm writing a song, I might have an idea, and there's a period initially where you kind of have that, gosh, is this clever or stupid? And you don't really know until you sit with it for a while and work with it. And if you play it for the wrong person, they just said, yeah, that's stupid, it's dead. It's never going to have a chance. You are never going to pull it out of the toolbox again. But if you work with someone that just is or live with someone as I do, who is just completely neutral and encouraging, gosh, that sounds great, I could play anything. He says, that sounds great, and it's so helpful to live with someone like that who doesn't judge. I mean, nobody likes being judged. It's punishing.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, there's a definite line between being judgmental and being
constructive criticism.
Well, yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Constructive criticism and working towards improvement. And that works great with some people. They accept that and they value it if they trust your opinion or anybody's opinion. If they don't, though, then it can have the opposite effect, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You become aversive to them, and you can just, it's hard to unring that bell once you have that impact on somebody. They see you as that, oh, there's that guy. He's full of himself. I don't agree with what he said. He told me he didn't like my guitar sound, and it's my favorite, so the heck with him, And you're probably right about the guitar sound at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And people do things all the time that I think are suboptimal or worse,
Yes. Yes.
And, just like the dogs, I don't yell at the dogs. I don't shock the dogs. I reward them when they do something good.
Yeah.
I hate to make the equation, but we're all animals and we all respond in a similar way.
One of the literature pieces that I make my students read at Northeastern is an experiment where they taught a blowfly to walk through a circle, a little opening in a piece of plastic for sugar water. So let's face it, if you can teach a blowfly, then you can teach a guitar player. No offense, guitar players.
No offense meant to guitar players. It could apply to anybody in any situation.
Oh, oboist, how's that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think for all of us, all human beings have some sort of insecurity about what they do, whether it's they don't think they're good enough or they compare themselves to somebody that's much better and they want to be like that person, but they can't be it, maybe because they lack the talent or maybe because they just lack the experience. But whatever the cause, they're insecure. And I find that the majority of people that are relatively inexperienced express that insecurity by, sort of going to the opposite extreme of being belligerent and a little bit annoying to cover their insecurity. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think that Skinner would say that insecurity is a hard behavior to measure. You'd have to say somebody who is belligerent, who talks over other people, who always interrupts, is that behavior that happens because other people let them do it? Other people put up with it, versus someone who holds up their hand and says, don't interrupt me, stop, versus the behavior of insecurity is a covert behavior. It's something that you can't see, right? I could describe my insecurities about that I'm 5'2", that I'm 10 pounds overweight, that around some people I'm less likely to say something, but in other situations I'm going to be the clear leader in the room. Everybody has, and I'm going to go to the E word again, environments where their behavior has been shaped to be confident, or the behavior has been shaped to not be confident, to be afraid to perform, to be afraid to say something. And oftentimes it's because a history of punishment. So let me tell you the story that I often tell about creativity. And creativity is a behavior that can be taught. You can teach someone to keep trying new things. But I was walking down the streets in Boston one day and I saw a crowd of people gathered around a car. This was probably, 10 or 15 years ago, when all cars still had a key that you opened up. There was 5 or 10 people standing around a car saying goodbye to whoever was in the car. And someone's little 3-year-old was, down at knee level, and Mama was looking in the window of the car, and the kid was like, Mama, Mama, and trying to get attention. So to keep him from bugging her, she just handed him her keys, as every mother has done since keys were made. Give the baby the keys so they'll leave you alone for a bit. So that child started doing the most creative and intelligent thing that you could ever do. He's standing in front of the lock on a car door, and he's got a handful of keys. So he starts trying to put keys in the car door lock. Beautiful, creative behavior. And the mom looks down at him, sees what he's doing, and smacks him on the top of the head. Now that potentially could have an impact on his creative behavior in the future. And so maybe insecurity is a history of criticism or punishment or not being allowed to do things that you were good at, and that other people have allowed you or reinforced your pompous behavior. If you look at the environments that people have been in, that's often the key to kind of deducing their behavior. And even if you find out what their past is, you can still use the principles of their behavior to change their behavior today. You just have to change portions of the environment.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but could you give us a concrete example?
Of changing a person's behavior who's being belligerent?
Yeah. I mean, be as specific as you want or as general as you want. I just want to get a sort of an illustration of what happens.
Yeah, sure. So there are lots of ways, for example, that people use language, right? And let's say someone works in a corporate setting, and it's a setting where people are kind to each other, where they include other people's opinions in a meeting. Everyone is going to get to give their opinion about something and create a consensus. And let's say if someone comes into that environment, and where they worked before, they were a high-powered manager, and their history is that they come into a meeting and they start pounding the table. This is how we're going to do it. This is what we do, period. Boom, boom, boom. Where I work now, someone is going to hold up their hand and say, that's not the way we do things here. These are the values in this institution. If you have any questions about them, let me know. But we don't speak to each other that way here. We don't use that language. We don't belittle people. And if you need some time to formulate what you're going to say instead, go ahead and do it. But if not, there's the door. I mean, sometimes the best thing to say is get out and come back when you can talk like everybody else in the room.
Yeah, well, that seems pretty extreme. I think a lot of times in the studio, the scenario is a lot more subtle than that.
Well, in the studio, that's a place where you just have to stop and take someone aside and say, look, what's the problem here? Why are you not listening to the bass player? We've asked you 4 times to play that beat with them. What's the problem? How can we help? A lot of times when people are belligerent, it's because they don't know what to do. They don't know how to behave. And so often the best thing to say is, how can I help? How can I help you play what I'm trying to make you play?
Right. Well, that's a really good point. And I think some of that can come about because of inexperience of the people engineering the session who, don't pick up on the cues that there's something that's making that person uncomfortable. I talked about this in a podcast episode a while back about how important it is to make the physical environment as comfortable as possible, so people don't have that distraction. Because let's face it, for a lot of people, going to the studio is pretty traumatic experience. No matter how many times they've done it, there's a lot of people that don't like it. It's just something that they have to do. There's other people, there's no place else on earth they'd rather be.
Yeah, true.
So we have this continuum between
Right.
those extremes. How do we make the environment comfortable for them? And what is it that they're lacking? And in this case, it can be the producer, the engineer, just watching people playing and saying, the problem is that his music stand is making him turn his head an uncomfortable way. He doesn't need to look at it continuously, but he does need to refer to it once in a while.
Right.
Can we move that music stand so it's in his line of sight where it makes it effortless for him to look at it? That's just simple, common sense stuff that I think gets neglected in the studio all the time.
Sure, even something as simple as, can you hear yourself when I press play? And people are afraid to say so. They're intimidated. They don't know how to advocate for themselves because of inexperience or, to use your word, insecurity. They haven't learned to advocate for themselves.
Or they advocate for the wrong thing.
Oh, I know. Ugh.
Okay, so that gives us some ideas of ways that when you're in that situation and you observe that going on, how you might be able to diffuse the tension a bit and get things back on track to where they should go. And I think that is, a fundamental skill anybody that's going to be in the recording studio has to have. No matter what their function is, they have to be sensitive to that.
Absolutely. It's a very tenuous environment. People are very attached to what is meaningful to them, and they're being asked to do things that maybe they haven't done before. And if they're the ultimate pro, then there isn't something that they can't play. So they've got a million of them. But if they're not that person who's done thousands of sessions, then they're not sure that they can play the part, and someone like you has to help set up the environment so that it's easier for them.
Right. Well, I'm thinking about a lot of times when I have somebody doing an overdub, on an instrument or a vocal or whatever, and it's just them, or maybe a couple of people involved in that session. It's not the whole band. A lot of times I will, as a producer, I will push them beyond their comfort zone just because here's your opportunity. If it doesn't work, nobody will ever hear it.
Right.
But go for it, because you might just get something that's just amazing and it's going to really make this recording stand out. It's sometimes difficult to get people to make that leap because, it would be for me, given in a similar situation, because I hate to do things I'm not good at. But there are times when I push myself into something that's definitely uncomfortable just to see what'll happen. And I think the studio is the perfect place to do that. It may also be true in rehearsals for a band that plays together all the time, but the studio, you only have to get it right once, and it's there forever. Now, how you're going to duplicate that when you play live is another problem. But.
Yeah, I was always told, don't worry about that. But you're right, because we have always, even when we have had players who had played thousands of sessions, just some of the most experienced people in the world, we've always asked them to play things we've never heard them play before. Stretch it out, stretch it out. It's really been fun to hear what comes of that, because they trusted us. The songs were good, and so at the end of the day, everyone was there voting for the song and a good outcome for that. And so if there's one thing that you can hold up to people who are having trouble, and you can just keep referencing back to what's best for the song, then I think that's another good strategy that I'm sure that you have used in the studio to help get rid of some parts that are just awful or not up to snuff for the song, because at the end of the day, it's the song that we're all supporting.
Right. And I think it's also important in that scenario, if there's other people around, they need to be supportive.
Right.
And I see often that's not the case. They're either disinterested or they just think it's a waste of time or whatever. And I think that's another attitude problem because, you don't even have to be in the same room, but just in the same environment. And people pick up on that sort of negativity.
Yeah, it's awful.
And impedes their ability to really go to their potential. Look at in a live performance. I mean, that's the epitome of that, where, the feedback you're getting from the audience is driving everything.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. I mean, if you're having a hard time getting a take and you're looking up and people are rolling their eyeballs, I mean, those are the people you can send out for coffee, because
right.
It's just not helpful. And it has such a dampening effect on the performance of the person who's struggling.
Okay, moving to an entirely different topic here. I'd like to get your musician's perspective on this. I often stress when I'm talking, to audio professionals, the ability to switch between listening with your head and listening with your heart. I think this applies to musicians as well, but I'd like your viewpoint on this, that you can be listening for hitting every single note exactly on pitch, exactly on time, to the point of perfection, and yet it has no feel to it, has no heart to it at all. And I think that it's really important that people develop the ability to have that sense of precision and make sure they do that as close to perfect as they can, but also to step back from it and say, is this really conveying the emotion of the song? Am I just getting all the notes perfect, but it doesn't mean anything? Because that's how the listener's going to respond to it. They don't really care if you hit all the notes perfectly. You have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that practice makes better. I know nothing's perfect, of course, but to be able to practice recording yourself and make recordings where every note is perfect, but it doesn't give you chills, and then get a great recording with a clam at the end. Well, okay, you can't use it, but what a great recording. At least I have a record like that, and if I did it that way once, then I can do it that way again. And at some point through practice, you reach a balance of the two. But it takes a lot of practice, a lot of doing it over and over and over and over again. And that's, in a lot of ways, that's the advantage of the kind of recordings that people can do in their bedroom and everywhere. I'm very lucky because my husband set up a beautiful setting for me to sit and record, and I practice. And boy, I know when it's great and I know when it's good, but I have so much experience. But you're looking for those chills. You're looking for excitement. What about the performance is exciting? And if it's not exciting to me, no one else is going to like it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think for me, a lot of times in the studio, when I get one of those takes that just gives you the chills or whatever, whatever emotion is supposed to evoke, and it does it just so perfectly, and yet the take is imperfect, technically. It could be technically imperfect because there was a problem in the recording. Mm-hmm. Typically people, when they reach that peak, they're probably singing or performing at a level much higher than what they had done before. So you could have unanticipated extremes in volume that maybe impact the sound of the recording. But more to the point, they may not hit that note exactly on pitch, or they may wander off the pitch on a sustained note or whatever. And yet, to me, a lot of times I'll say, that's acceptable to me because it's going to communicate. It's going to reach the listener. You know, I sort of feel guilty because my peers will hear that every time and say, and they may say to me or may not, they may say, why did you let that go like that? And I said, because it did what it needed to do, even if it wasn't perfect.
It's true. And, 10 years from now, who's going to hear that? But I think for every artist, they have to know what they can live with. At the end of the day, it's their name. If they have someone like you that they trust and it's going to meet the need, whatever the purpose of the recording is, then you're good. But if it isn't, and if it doesn't serve the song as well as it could, at least you know you've got 98%. There's no reason, and it might take you some time, and it might have to be on a different day, that it can't happen again. That's my take, as you would say.
Are there any other things that you think are important to talk about in this context that we haven't gotten to already?
Well, I think one thing that we didn't mention that's interesting as far as music and recording is superstitious behavior, which is behavior that historically seems like it had an impact on your performance, but maybe didn't. But it becomes reinforced such that you cannot go into the studio without your lucky socks on, or where's my favorite cup, or if I don't have the right tea, and that's not the kind of honey I use. If you know what people's superstitions are, you can help make them even more comfortable and help get the right performance that you want, because in the past, when those things were around them, you got the behavior that you wanted, you got the performance that you wanted. But honestly, I think that your attitude, your philosophy of helping the people in the studio to get the best performance by moving the music stand, I mean, that's the kind of insight that a good recordist needs and that a good producer needs. And as someone who has been around the block with that kind of stuff, good, bad, and ugly, it's magnificent that you're there to do the work.
I'm just trying to get the best I can.
Well, aren't we all?
Yeah. One other thing that I'd like to get your comment on is, a lot of times people in the studio that we do a take and they are happy with their performance. They come into the control room and they listen to it, or they listen to it back on the headphones or whatever. And if it sounds great on playback, they are energized. And they may even say, keep that one, let's do another one. But if they come in and it doesn't sound right for whatever reason, and it could be technical or it could be performance, that has the opposite effect.
Yeah, it's punishing, right?
Yeah, right. So I always have the philosophy that even if the ultimate listener is going to be listening to this song on, the speaker in their phone from a streaming service, which is pretty brutal to the beautiful recording we did, that having the performer hear it in its best possible light is always going to make them perform better.
Always, because they can't reproduce that themselves. And it's like giving someone like an outfit to wear for the Grammys that they would never buy for themselves, or it's like giving someone a musical makeover by letting them sound so much better than they ever have before. And again, it raises the bar of what they can do, right? And so reinforcing to that performance, because now they're like, I didn't know that I could sound like that. Well, you can sound like that. And so go keep sounding like that. You've absolutely made the likelihood of a performance like that in the future, you've increased that likelihood. It's going to happen again.
Yeah, I think I've been using these behavioral tools all along without really knowing what I was doing.
No doubt about it. It sounds like it completely.
Terri, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I find it fascinating, and your insights into it from, your pretty unique perspective, I think, is really, really useful. If people wanted to hear your music, how could they go about doing that?
Stay tuned, because we're in the process. Remember, I was out of the music business for 20 years learning about behavior. And so we're in the process of just getting back going on recording. I have 12 new songs that I've written in the last 18 months, and they are the best songs I have ever written. So just stay tuned, and once they're good to go, I'll tell you and you tell your listeners. How's that?
That sounds great. Yep. Once you have that material available to the public, I will modify the description and include links so that they can hear what you do. Well, thank you so much, Terri. I've really enjoyed this.
Thank you, Doug. I'm so glad to be on the show. I'm a fan, and so this is great to go on my musical resume.
I've been talking with applied behavioral expert and singer-songwriter Terri Bright. Thank you for listening, liking, subscribing, and commenting on any episode. Please share this podcast link with anyone you think would be interested. You can reach me at dwfern@dwfern.com. Thanks. This is my take on music recording. I'm Doug Fern. See you next time.